Ilana, Zach, thank you for joining us. President Trump discussed police reform and the economy on Thursday at a roundtable with community leaders in Dallas. Meanwhile, he appears to also be at odds with some members of his own administration, in particular on the issue of changing the names of military bases named after Confederate leaders. Skyler Henry is at the White House with details.
Your reaction to Millie.
President Trump ignored questions before heading to Dallas for a discussion on economic and justice disparities with faith leaders and law enforcement officers.
We're working to finalize an executive order that will encourage police departments nationwide to meet the most current professional standards of force. And that means force, but force with compassion. But if you're going to have to really do a job, if somebody's really bad, you're going to have to do it with real strength.
Ahead of the president's trip, his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, accused him of avoiding meaningful conversations on race and dividing the country.
When he speaks and gives credibility to these racist folks out there, he breathes out, they come out from under the rocks.
We will not rest until the changes are made.
House Democrats announced their massive police reform proposal earlier this week, and Senate Republicans, led by South Carolina's Tim Scott, are expected to unveil theirs soon. The ongoing protests have reignited debate about whether 10 U.S. Army bases named for Confederate leaders should be renamed. President Trump doubled down on his opposition, tweeting Thursday, "Those that deny their history are doomed to repeat it." But military leaders and even some congressional Republicans say they're open to it.
If we're going to have bases throughout the United States, I think it should be with the names of individuals who fought for our country.
Meanwhile, in a video message to military students, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, expressed regret for accompanying President Trump to St. John's Church last week.
That sparked a national debate about the role of the military in civil society. I should not have been there.
The administration received harsh criticism after federal officers cleared peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square ahead of that walk. Skyler Henry, CBS News, the White House.
And Skyler Henry is joining me now, and so is Charles Marino. He's the CEO of Sentinel Security Solutions and a former senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Skyler, I want to start with you. During the Dallas roundtable, the president listed 4 steps to, quote, rebuild safety. Would you tell our audience about those 4 steps and why he chose Dallas as a location in which to have this discussion on race and criminal justice?
Well, hey, Ilana, good evening to you. Well, the 4 steps start with economic development in minority communities. The president has touted his administration's work in terms of opportunity zones in communities of color, but he said that there is more work that needs to be done. He also wants minority business owners to have access to more capital. Second on that list is the healthcare disparities that exist in communities of color. He said that his administration wants to put more money towards addressing chronic conditions that are impacting communities of color, as well as addressing the facilities themselves. He called them, quote, a disgrace. And so he wants to make sure that the appropriate amount of money is going there. Third on that list, he said, is perhaps the biggest civil rights issue of our time, and that is school choice now, allowing parents to have the opportunity to send their students where they want to go to school, not necessarily be geographically tied to whatever area it is that they have to get an education. But in terms of like police reform and things that we were expecting to see, the president did say that it is time to create some sort of a national standard for police departments across the country to follow. That includes things like de-escalation training. Now, as for why he chose Dallas, it's a bit of a 2 birds, 1 stone sort of thing, where the president could address the racial disparities happening across the country. Obviously, this is one of the first times that he's done so since the incident that happened with George Floyd. But he also happens to be having a campaign fundraiser a little later on today. And of course, this is campaign season. He is trying to win re-election here. So he's trying to dip his toe in both pools here, Lana.
Sure. And Skyler, new polls are actually showing that President Trump is losing favor with Texas voters. He spoke at that roundtable about how solid his support is in Texas. Why are the polls saying anything otherwise?
Well, The interesting thing about Texas, right, historically speaking, at least for the last 40 some odd years or so, is that it has voted predominantly red. I mean, the last time that they voted for a Democratic presidential nominee was Jimmy Carter, and that was in the 70s. But now you have to start looking at the Democratic makeup of Texas. I mean, you see African, Hispanic, and Asian Americans all starting to grow in terms of a population in Texas in and of itself. You also start to see the emergence of young professionals who are starting to live in these huge Texas cities, a lot of them coming from California and the Northwest as well, because of how expensive it is in, say, a Seattle or a San Francisco, Los Angeles, things like that. It's a lot more affordable to be in Texas, so there's this wave of people coming there for that. And then you also have to remember this. 3 of Texas' largest cities are run by Democratic mayors. Houston, Dallas, and Austin all run by Democratic mayors, and San Antonio just happens to be run by an independent mayor as well. And so that's, I think, where you're starting to see a bit of a shift in terms of the change there in Texas. Of course, it's a matter of waiting and seeing what happens in November.
Skyler, I want to talk about that a little bit more, but first I want to bring Charles into this conversation. Charles, you're the security expert. So what do you make of the president's response to police reform and racial injustice and those 4 steps that he was outlining that Skyler just described?
Yeah, I think you almost have 4 pillars there of what's really, when working all together, can help build safety and security within the country. As far as the executive order that he mentioned regarding law enforcement departments across this country, the standardization and professionalization of use of force policies and procedures has actually been an ongoing conversation for quite some time. And I think it's actually quite realistic that this get taken on in a very insightful and productive way to ensure that police departments across the country are using a system of use of force policies that are consistent and that are also appropriate for various situations that officers around the country are going to encounter. You know, of the 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers in the U.S., the majority go to work each and every day and do their jobs and do it very well. It's the minority of what we saw in Minneapolis, where, you know, a police officer and others don't put forth the correct use of force, and what they do is really a disservice to the law enforcement community in this country. So we want to make sure that our officers are trained in this country, have the best equipment, and have great relationships with those within their communities.
So, Charles, to follow up on that, did you think that the president's proposal, those 4 pillars, does enough to really weed out the racial systemic injustices that have existed in some of the police departments across the country, or arguably all the police departments across the country? And is he actually hitting at that issue that has galvanized so many people, or are these just really these broader reforms that the president was already looking at?
Yeah, I mean, we really have to look at what the cause of the current crisis is across the country, and that is the incident that took place with George Floyd. And anybody in this country and anybody in law enforcement is going to tell you that it was disgusting. It should never have happened, and no citizen in this country should ever be treated that way by a law enforcement official in this country. You will hear no dissent from that opinion, especially within the law enforcement community. Whether or not it goes enough with respect to reforms with the law enforcement community, I'm really interested to see at the micro level the proposals that come out. I think some of the areas that need to be addressed are community policing. This is where the tough conversations need to take place between law enforcement and those in the community, those that want to see changes, those that often agree on areas that need to change. I think it's inexcusable that some police departments within this country are still not using body cameras. I think we need to see a more systemic approach there. Body cameras, dash cameras within the police vehicles. You know, these safeguard citizens as much as they do as the law enforcement. professionals. Training, right? What is that training going to include? So there's really a whole host of areas that I haven't yet heard enough detail about to know how serious this is.
Right, the big goals, but it really matters when you get down to those details. Skyler, one last question for you. President Trump plans to hold his first post-coronavirus campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma next Friday, June 19th, which is also known as Juneteenth, the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the end of slavery. And in Tulsa, which is preparing to honor the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, one of the worst incidences of racial violence in the country, what is the campaign saying about that decision and the criticism that they faced?
Well, Anna, the criticism just out the gate has been this is ill-advised and relatively tacky, just given the nature of the state of affairs in the country right now and the fact that the president plans to hold his rally there. But from the Trump administration, from the RNC, and from the Trump campaign altogether, they say that they are very aware of the date and very aware of the significance that having a rally in Tulsa could have. They did say, however, that if anything, Republicans should be celebrating the fact that the president is holding a rally on that day in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We actually heard from one Republican senator who said that it was the Republican Party who emancipated black people, of course, referring to Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, the Republican Party was much different back then than it is now. But they say that this is actually an opportunity for people to come together. They say that it does not fall on deaf ears, the fact that this is happening on this date. I think the president does have an opportunity to unify the country and address race relations that he may not have done in the past on that specific date. And I think a lot of people who are hopeful that the president does say something unifying, they hope that it happens during that rally next week.
All right, we will be listening for those remarks. Skyler Henry, Charles Marino, thank you.